Giving the community a voice. Haver FM. How Community Radio.
Welcome to another Heeds and Hearts Scotland podcast. Our charity was founded in June 2021 to create, inspire and promote social connections through community arts projects in the How and wider North East Fife. We are working with communities impacted by the gradual dismantling of local infrastructure and services, lack of housing, limited transport links and the integration into our everyday lives of digital technology, contributing to social isolation and loneliness. There has been a lot of research on the effects of loneliness on our mental and physical health. It's seen as one of the biggest health concerns we face. Loneliness is as harmful to our health as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Heeds and Hearts are working alongside local people and groups to build a programme of cultural activities based in the village halls. Governments and organisations such as WHO have researched the evidence supporting the value of the arts to alleviate loneliness. This can take many different forms, everything from singing to painting to writing. There are no age requirements for experiencing these benefits.
This Saturday, the 25th of February, will see the launch of a brand new festival celebrating all things real bread. The Scottish Real Bread Festival, organised by Scotland the Bread, rounds off Real Bread Week, the 18th to 26th February, and will take place at the Bowhouse in St Monans. Packed with workshops, talks, hands-on activities, films, bannock and ballads, and activities for all ages, the action switches across the day from the main stage to the demo area and across to workshops and tours. It all starts at 10:30am and runs across the day till 4pm. Everyone is welcome, and check out scotlandthebread.org for all the details. Back in May, during our Haver FM How Community Radio project, we interviewed Andrew Whitley and Connie Hunter from Scotland the Bread, and so we present that remixed interview in advance of the festival.
My name is Connie Hunter and I'm the Miller Manager for Scotland the Bread here at Bowhouse. Scotland the Bread is a collaborative project to grow better grain and bake better bread in Scotland. So here on the Balcaski estate, we're growing different varieties of heritage wheats and some rye as well that we have had tested and found that they are more nutrient dense than commercially grown grains nowadays. And we're milling them here on our innovative Zentrafan mill, which is a cool running mill, so it preserves the nutrients much better, into a very fine wholemeal flour. So we can actually say that we're growing and milling a really nutrient-rich wholemeal flour. And we sell it to bakeries and shops, to the general public, all over Scotland.
Good morning, I'm Andrew Whitley. I'm chair of Bread for Good Community Benefit Society, which is better known as Scotland the Bread. And I'm also co-founder of the Real Bread campaign. What we're trying to do is to address some very long-standing historical injustices which have meant that people without very much money have been forced to eat the worst quality food, and particularly that's true about bread. Going back a couple of hundred years, the deal was if you didn't have much money, you had to subsist on a pretty adulterated version of bread, which was made with white flour and a lot of dodgy additives. And that is a description that you could apply to the present day, albeit with some change in the nature of the flour and the additives. In other words, people need to have a lot of money in order to exercise any control over the food system and the food that they put in their body. And we think this is unfair. It's also having desperately bad consequences on our natural environment and the landscape around us, because the big growing, milling and baking corporations are they've tuned agriculture in Scotland particularly to fit the needs of their shareholders rather than the needs of people for healthy food. And so we find an extraordinary situation in Scotland, which used to be self-sufficient and actually in the late Middle Ages was exporting wheat to the Low Countries. It now grows nigh on 1 million tons of wheat a year on some of its best land, but it doesn't use more than a few hundred tons of that to make bread for people to eat. Indeed, the majority of that wheat goes to feed animals and cars, and also the bottle habit in terms of being made into cheap booze, which does nothing to improve public health. And what we're saying is this is a scandalous misuse of resources. We don't blame the farmers because they're responding to the price signals and in a sense, the demands of the commodity market. But we do think that there is an opportunity to construct little projects such as Scotland the Bread, which is not aiming to conquer the world or even Scotland. It's aiming to be a proof of concept, if you like, of a different food system where we've rebuilt relationships of trust between the people who grow the food and the people who process it and eat it.
The project started in 2016, I think, with Andrew looking for old Scottish varieties and in sort of gene banks around the world, although I'm sure he can talk about that in more detail than I can, having them tested to find out their nutrient density and then growing them up so that we would be able to have enough quantity to actually grow a crop. So that took a few years. And it wasn't until 2018 that we actually moved here to Bowhouse and made this our permanent home. And since then, that's when I joined as the miller manager. And since then, it's been a process of gradually becoming more efficient. When we first started, we had one mill that could do 25 kilos at once. Now we have 2 mills that can both do upwards of 125 kilos at once. So yeah, we're gradually getting more efficient. We're gradually upscaling. But what's interesting about Scotland the Bread is actually there are limits to how big we can get, and that's good. What our vision is not for us to become a huge mill that provides flour to the whole of Scotland. Our vision is of lots of smaller mills all around the country where farmers, millers and bakers talk to each other more and are more, each person in the chain is involved in the other bits of the chain, because if bakers need certain kinds of grains and then the farmers can grow those, but we also want to be able to have really nutrient-rich grains rather than just ones that are really easy to grow. So there has to be some dialogue about that. And as we can see in the current crisis, we're so dependent on grain imports from Central Europe, and we're really in a vulnerable situation with that. So we're trying to, highlight the fact that actually you can grow bread-making grains in Scotland. We're doing it. It's possible. But sometimes it just might require slightly more, some of the grains that we're growing, maybe they need to be kneaded slightly less because the gluten isn't quite as strong. So it's almost, that's why it's good that we can work with bakers and have a good relationship with them. And sort of, we're really trying to create a better system together.
What we're trying to suggest is that it doesn't need to cost very much more to feed yourself with better bread. What you need to do is to eat fewer slices of bread that's got more in it and which has been fermented properly by a baker who knows what they're doing without any non-food additives and chemical jiggery-pokery to make it seem as though it's very light and very soft and very long-lasting. And you then need to, the other thing that reduces the absolute cost of your spend on bread, or the cost per slice actually ingested, is that you need to stop wasting it. And the sad thing is that even people on low incomes are caught up in a system where we're almost programmed to waste a third of the bread that's actually bought in the UK. There's absolutely scandalous statistics of food waste, and some of that is not even opened. So people on, with really struggling with both food and fuel poverty at the moment find themselves in a situation where something about the overall arrangement, maybe it's a lack of respect for the bread product itself because it's so cheap, means, or something to do with its supposedly never-ending shelf life, which actually doesn't really deliver, but people end up wasting it. And so we want to turn this around in terms of people's perceptions, get everybody to realize the gross injustice that's been done to us all, by those who control our food system and have done for 200 years, importing food from elsewhere in order to keep the price down so that they can pay us wages that are only just above the cost of avoiding starvation. I'm talking in rather dramatic terms, but that was the deal in the 19th century. And translating it into modern terms, it's not very different when you look at the availability of healthy food and the cultural context in which people find it so difficult to change, because we all are creatures of both habit and of a herd instinct. So we like to be doing the things that other people are doing. And what other people are doing in the bread arena is responding to the advertising and the misleading marketing of bread products, which appear to be cheap only if you look at the cost of the checkout, but actually pull in enormous costs elsewhere in the system, which we actually pay for, both in terms of our personal health, because there isn't enough fiber and there are dodgy additives in the bread, and in terms of the environmental consequences of the way in which it's grown. So the leaching of nitrates from chemical farming, which produces this wheat, those nitrates get into the water. They have to be taken out before it's fit to drink. And we have to pay for that through our rates or our water rates or whatever. And the same is true of pesticide residues. Not to mention the bigger picture, which I think we're all at some level, however well off or poorly off we are concerned about, which is the fact that this farming system is obliterating biodiversity, the rich life of diverse plants and insects and microorganisms on which we absolutely depend. If we knock those out in the interests of producing tons and tons of wheat, which we're not even eating directly, then we will look very stupid to the visitor from another planet who finds what we've done to this one.
We grow a lot of wheat in this country, but none of it goes to human consumption. It's for, animal feed or making alcohol. And so we're trying to say, look, it's possible to grow bread-making grains. We might not get such a high yield, but if those grains are more nutrient dense, we may not need to eat as many of them to get the same amount of nourishment from them. So we're starting to look at now, we have a project with the University of Edinburgh looking at the number of people nourished per hectare as a new, better measurement for agricultural output than simply tons per hectare. But the actual mill itself is basically one piece of volcanic rock with a hole in the middle, and the grain falls down into the hole, and a fan pushes air upwards into the hole, creates a cyclone to spin the grain round and round, and it hits the stone as it goes round, grinds itself into a fine wholemeal flour. It's only blown out into the flour bin once it's light enough to be blown out, which is really different to a traditional stone mill, which has two stones grinding on each other. So this is a different system. Its benefits include that we're not creating a lot of friction, a lot of heat. So actually we're preserving the nutrients in the flour much better. It's safer, there's less risk of sparks, so we can leave it on overnight without anyone needing to be here, which makes up for it being sort of slightly slower than some other mills. The mills are made in Germany, and we have two of them now, so we use one for wheat and one for rye. They're good. They produce a really fine wholemeal flour, which is good because it means people can use it for scones and pastries and cakes, not just bread. But you're still getting all that nutrition that you would from a normal wholemeal. Scotland the Bread is a proud member of the Real Bread campaign, which advocates for bread that's simply, flour, water, salt, and yeast if you want to. But we would promote a sourdough rather than a yeasted bread, just because it's pre-fermenting and breaking down some of the nutrients, making them more available to your gut by the time it gets there. So lots of bread that you can buy in the supermarkets has got a lot of preservatives in it. If you look at the ingredients list, there's loads of things in there you've never heard of. It's so that it's got a really long shelf life. So it's really easy and quick and fast to produce. And it's just really far removed from, what we would have been eating even 70, 80 years ago.
I left London in 1976 to start a bakery. And really that was that was the only thing I could think I could do to pay the mortgage. What I really wanted to do was to grow my own food and be as self-sufficient as I could, because I was getting concerned about the environmental crisis, wanting to do something practical about it. But I had no real sort of rural skills. And by chance, I met somebody who was restoring a water mill and said, "Oh, somebody ought to start a bakery to use our flour." And I responded to that. What I discovered as a baker over many years was that my customers actually started to say to me, this would be 20 years after I'd started baking fairly ordinary bread, albeit out of organic, locally grown wheat, or UK grown wheat, which was fairly unusual at the time. But when I started going into sourdough, which I'd always known about because I spent a year in Moscow University as part of my degree, and I therefore ate a lot of sourdough bread and I liked it. But I never made it because I perceived that none of my customers would want it and didn't. So when I started doing that on a slightly bigger scale, and then Waitrose came along and said, we want loads and loads of this sourdough bread, I thought, what's going on here? And my customers were effectively saying, look, we can't eat ordinary bread, but your bread ticks the box for us. And I didn't know why, but it turned out that it was something to do with the fact that it was made, the original rye bread that I made for Waitrose was made without wheat. So there was a wheat issue appearing and a gluten issue alongside that. And in those days, in the early 90s, very much a yeast issue as well. A lot of people saying, I've had a test, I'm allergic to yeast and I'm getting candida as a fungal infection, which is related to, there are species of yeast which are candida yeast, which you find in fermentation and so on. And I didn't know what was going on. So I started investigating. And then when I left the bakery after 25 years and got an offer to write a recipe book, I determined to actually make this my take on where we'd gone wrong with our bread. You know, the contrast between what I was trying to do and the industrial white sliced loaf was so great. And it then, doing the research as best I could, although it involved a lot of sort of molecular biology and stuff like that, which I was very unfamiliar with. But nevertheless, it was still very easy to see that the deficiencies in the industrial loaf were multiple, and they actually affected every stage, from the soils in which we grow the wheat plants or the rye to the varieties that we choose, and that the plant breeders have been encouraged and sort of funded to develop over the last 50 years. Highly specific, very monoclonal, as they say, so very little genetic diversity in them, but enormously productive. And crucially, with this dwarfing gene in it from Japan, which was the sort of structural basis of the Green Revolution, so-called, it enabled the much greater yields of wheat and rice to be made on varieties which were adapted to an agricultural system that used heavy applications of chemical fertilizer. Thus, you got an enormous amount of yield. But it turned out that when you looked at modern varieties against older ones, pre-Green Revolution varieties, you found certain deficiencies, both negative and negative in the sense of losses of minerals and other nutritional components, but also increases in the expression of certain proteins, such as glutenin, which is one of the components of the polymer, which is called gluten, which actually trigger the intolerance response and in some cases celiac disease, which quite a large proportion of the population, like sort of 45% of the UK population, has a natural mutation, which makes them predisposed to problems of digesting wheat. And we sort of move the dial by plant breeding. And then the final stage really is in the processing, because after the development of the Chorleywood bread process in 1961, which was an enormously noble effort in many ways to try and replace imported Canadian high protein wheat, which was costing a lot of money, with locally grown wheat, something that we obviously support in terms of import substitution, support for local farming. But nevertheless, that was only achieved that what they set themselves another target, which was to make the bread as similar to what you would get with a high protein imported grain. And the only way they could do that was by putting in certain additives. So between 1961 and, in fact, before that really, but between then and the late 80s, early 90s, there were two additives used to make the bread light and fluffy, potassium bromate and azodicarbonamide, which turned out to be carcinogens. So, how many years is that? It's nearly 30 years. The British population, the vast majority of whom were eating industrial bread, sliced bread, were being experimented on with a potential carcinogen. And really, the regulatory regime that permitted that and the justification for doing it just to make the bread a little bit fluffier and even more devoid of nutrients, that seemed to me to be a crime. It was a theft of nutrients and also an insertion of toxins into our food supply that really was an outrage. And so I put that in the book, Bread Matters, that I published in 2006. And then all hell broke loose because everyone said, what the hell? What's going on here? And we need a campaign to alert everybody to it. So we, 2 years later in 2008, we started with Sustain in London, a sort of amalgam organization of food and farming organizations. We started the Real Bread campaign and started to go out there and saying, let's change the system and make bread better for you, for your community, and for the planet, for the environment. And that means attending to each of these stages, the soil and the grain choices, the processing, and actually the route to market, if you like. Because if you leave that in the hands of a monopolistic supermarket system, which effectively it is, 70, 80% of our food is accessed from those organizations, then you can't expect anything other than a fairly cynical application of the law of low price and convenience. And actually, quite a large number of those years, the supermarkets were selling bread at below the cost of production as a loss leader to get people into the store, and they'd make up the loss by overcharging for other products that people needed. It was always seen as a way, if you didn't have a good bread offer, you wouldn't get the customers through the door, and supermarkets depend on a regularly increasing footfall.
Our mission really now is to work as closely as possible with the community bakeries that we've developed really good relationships with throughout the whole project, but especially in the last few years during the pandemic, we've been running a project called Flour to the People, running baking workshops and getting people, involved in baking bread and seeing how easy it is actually to make sourdough and how much tastier it is. We have a project whereby people can buy flour on behalf of community bakeries on our website. It's called our Solidarity Flour Scheme, which allows us to provide free flour to community projects all across Scotland. So if you're running a community project and you need any flour, please fill in the form on our website. And what we want to do is be able to sort of expand that and work with communities in a way that says, actually, it's not right that you can't afford good quality food. It's not right that good food should be out of reach of everyone. It's actually food is a right. And if we can try and work towards that in some form through working with our community partners, that's the sort of direction we really want to be going in. We want to be able to have a product that is good, that is nutritious, that bakers can use. And we want to be able to have good jobs for people, have a good relationship with the farmer and have a good system set up for cleaning and drying and storing. We want to be able to support other projects across Scotland who may be interested in doing something similar and getting a mill and growing some grain and relocalizing our grain economies.
On the grain side, we discovered, I personally discovered as a baker, very familiar with the differences between locally grown grain and imported grain and so on. I began to discover a little bit about plant breeding, got involved in a project which was very interesting down in Suffolk with the late Professor Martin Wolfe, who developed the first composite cross population of very different wheat varieties crossed with each other, and then the progeny grown on rather than selected for the best one to multiply that one. They grew on the population in order to try and build on, as Martin would have said, the capacity for resilience that you would get from a very diverse genetics in the crop. And that now exists out there as the YQ population, YQ standing for yield and quality, because they were trying to get a balance between the two. It's a bit of a thing in the sort of community grain networks around the UK. It's not thousands of tons, but hundreds certainly of that grain is being grown to the great benefit of local bakers who really do take an interest and give a damn about the quality of the nutrients and the environmental context of the growing of the grain that they're using to make their bread. And so you can see that this is very much a joined up project. We've got a lot to say about everything from soil to slice. And we're trying to say this to people in a whole variety of ways, energizing people to actually rise up against the injustice that's been done to them through the bread system, but also to make it possible for people in community growing groups to grow some of our older varieties and more diverse wheats in a community garden context. There's one down in Leith. They're dotted around all over the place, as many as we can support with the money that we have to raise from the public. And they grow the grain on a small plot, maybe 10, 20 square meters or something. Watch it developing, keep the birds off it with a bit of luck, and then harvest it, thresh it. We crowdfunded for a little thresher, which we can make available to community groups. Then we mill it. Sometimes they do it themselves. Sometimes we mill it on our mills here in the Bowhouse, and then they make it into bread. And that is a wonderful learning experience because it actually engages people with the entire food system, really. The growing of it, the agronomy, if you like, the biology, but also the amazing social effects and psychological, and I would say spiritual as well, effects that can accompany everything from being in among a series of tall wheat plants, in nature and really up there and right with the green in your face kind of thing, but also sharing bread round the table, which you or your group has had a hand in making. Everything changes when you can see the beginning, the middle, and the end of a process, and you feel involved at every stage. And actually, you may have had some say in what you put in the ground that year in that place. And I want to see a system where that defines our whole cereal growing thing, not farmers dancing to the tune of commodity markets or plant breeders in the James Hutton who are refining the yield of malting barley to the nth degree, but actually people saying, we'd like to grow a crop of this variety of wheat because it tastes so fantastic, or it works really well for our ethnic community making a chapatis or naan or, injera or something like that. And there's so many ways in which we can re-engage with our wheat, grain, and flour supply that will enhance well-being. And it starts with the grain because we want to find the varieties that have got as much in them as a wheat plant can give us in terms of minerals, vitamins, phenolic compounds, all the goodies that you can get out of a wheat plant. But even that isn't good enough. To find high nutrient wheat, you've got to make sure that you don't throw it all away at the milling stage, taking all the nutrients out with the bran, which is really vital to our health and our digestion, and just consuming it as white powder. And then the next stage is really important too. The way you turn it into bread can either make or break all the qualities that you've spent a lot of time building into your, or coaxing out of the ground, if you like, with careful farming and conservation milling. Because if you then just zap a whole load of fast-acting yeast into it, and mix it up with high-speed mixing and additives, then I'm afraid most of the nutrients will actually whiz through your body and come out the end without having done you any good. So this is nothing if not a completely joined up end-to-end project. And we all need to get our hands dirty in the sense that we need to take a view as to whether or not the bread that we like to buy and where we get it from whether the baker of that bread has actually attended to each of those stages respectfully and properly and is trying to do something better rather than just trying to sell us something cheap and convenient.
I think the current crisis has brought into focus that how vulnerable we are when our food supplies are coming from so far away. And I really hope that it can lead to a greater support and promotion of more local, seasonal, organic producers. I do feel hopeful for that. I think scaling those things up is perhaps one challenge, and I think we really, as someone who's also a farmer as well as a miller, I can sort of see the other side of that, and I think we don't want our products to be only affordable to people who can afford it, and the cost of living crisis is bringing that at the same time into really sharp focus. We really need concerted action from politicians, people who care, policymakers, so that we can make good food affordable for everyone. We already subsidize food and farming, and in so many ways, but we need to really decide how we do that in a way that actually means that we can feed everyone really well, instead of it just being something that wealthy people can afford. So I'm hopeful for that. That would be yeah. I'm hoping that all of these different crises can lead us to the Good Food Nation bill that's going through the Scottish Parliament now. Yeah, we need to be having these kind of conversations, taking it seriously.
The Scottish Real Bread Festival takes place this Saturday, the 25th of February, at the Bowhouse in St Monans. For times and details, visit scotlandthebread.org. Thank you for listening.
Haver FM, How Community Radio, is supported by the Fife Communities Mental Health and Wellbeing Fund through Fife Voluntary Action and the Scottish Government.